Hello and welcome to yet another episode of On the Grid Podcast, Season 4, Episode 15. And what a special episode we have for you guys today, as we're not talking very well about our friends over at Red Bull. We have a different winner this time out, and a first-time winner. But before we go into looking over the sprint race, the sprint shootout, the qualifying, and the race at the Miami Grand Prix, let's introduce ourselves. I'm your host, Adrian. Joining me is Ethan Evans, my co-host. Ethan, a different race, a new winner, no Max Verstappen on the top step of the podium.
Well, it's about time, isn't it, for many things? And maybe we've got a new team that can actually challenge Red Bull on a consistent basis. Who knows? But yeah, great race for one man in particular.
Let's point this out. McLaren, who is the team in question, did have 10 upgrades put on their car before the start of the Miami Grand Prix weekend. How much did that help them? Is the simple answer. And I know that's the simple question, should I say? Well, I know the simple answer from you, Ethan.
Well, I think what's encouraging is that I think Oscar Piastri had what, four or five of the upgrades, and he was on very, very similar pace to Carlos Sainz. So, maybe those four or five upgrades bring them level with Ferrari. Do those four or five upgrades that Lando Norris had that Oscar Piastri didn't? Does that put them on a par with Red Bull? Because we saw in the second stint, Lando Norris was quicker than Max Verstappen. In the first stint, Oscar Piastri was only 3 seconds behind Max Verstappen without half the upgrades. So, is there a cause for concern? Let's not get our hopes up too much. I still think Max Verstappen is going to win a lot of races this season. But, is there a little spark of hope?
Maybe a glimmer of hope that McLaren can potentially overthrow the Bulls once and for all. But let's kind of have a bit of an overview of what happened during the weekend before we dive into our average driver ratings. So, sprint shootout. Let's look at probably the biggest talking point from that session. Daniel Ricciardo, P4. Is he finally delivering what is needed of him to put himself in that shop window, or as we saw throughout the rest of the weekend, was it just kind of an anomaly, should we say?
Well, let's not speak too soon because we saw what he did in qualifying and then in the actual race. So I think let's exercise a bit of caution. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves, which I know is difficult for Formula One. But it was a great performance, not only in qualifying but in the sprint race as well. So it's about time, and he announced himself well, got his tally going for the season. So hopefully it's a sign of things to come for Daniel Ricciardo.
Let's jump onto Mercedes, your team. In the sprint, not brilliant, but in the race, they turned it around. Do you think that because we saw in China, Mercedes, especially Lewis Hamilton, heavily focused themselves on the sprint, and the race was kind of on the back burner, should we say, especially with qualifying so poor. This time around in Miami, it was roles reversed, where we saw the two Mercedes drivers knocked out in SQ2, but kind of bring it back in the race and in qualifying itself. I believe it was seventh and eighth for the race. Do you? I'm not going to speak too far ahead of myself, but do you think that Mercedes don't have a nailed-on setup for it to work both in the race and in the sprint? Do you think that maybe they're sort of maybe adjusting to the sprint format, the new sprint format especially, or is it just down to pure luck or down to the track itself?
Do you know what? I don't even know if I want to speak about Mercedes at this moment in time. It's an absolute mess, whatever's going on there. The fact they still don't actually know how to work the car. The simulator data has been off every single race for the last 3 years. So, do you know what? I think let's focus on the positive. Let's focus on teams that done well. But yeah, Mercedes is not looking good. I know they had a few updates. Hamilton looked racy towards the end on that medium tire. Just didn't have a straight line speed to make any overtakes. But we'll have to wait and see. It's a different weekend. There wasn't much practice running, so it's always going to be difficult. But let's see what happens moving forward in the next few races.
As you say, let's talk about other teams that are doing well. Let's point out a driver that outqualified his teammate for the first time in his F1 career. Logan Sargent, on a technicality, outqualifies Alex Albon as his lap time was deleted in SQ1. I don't know how much confidence that could give him, because obviously, I mean, we say confidence. In the sprint, he finished 10th compared to Alex Albon's 13th. So in terms of a sprint, you look at it, it's a positive result. And then in terms of qualifying as well, there was a positive result there, even though Alex Albon was able to qualify Q2. With it being technically his home race, as this track is the closest track to where he was born, how much confidence do you think Logan Sargent can take from a weekend like this where the crowd is behind you, the crowd is gunning for you, and the crowd is wanting you to do well? Whereas in other situations, he's kind of like on the back burner and essentially running from last.
This is why it's so difficult to judge on a weekend like on a sprint weekend who's actually performed well and who's not, because you look at the sprint and you got to say Logan Sargent was very, very good. Outqualified his teammate, finished 10th in the sprint. But then if you look at the race, obviously DNF, which I don't think was his fault, but his pace was nowhere. So how much do you look into it? So it's difficult to say, but a good performance in the sprint. Hopefully he can use a bit of that momentum moving forwards. So we'll just have to wait and see.
And one final thing before we kind of dissect and look over our average driver ratings. The Danish Minister of Defense, Kevin Magnussen, a lot of penalties. Is he turning potentially into the new Esteban Ocon in terms of penalties? And in terms of actually driving in a straight line and looking forward, because like we saw in that race, I think we can both agree that the crash between him and Logan Sargent was solely his fault. Um, he wasn't even he was alongside, but he wasn't ahead in the corner, and I don't think Logan Sargent is backing out from the corner as it is his corner. What did you think of K-Mag, especially this weekend? Because I don't think it was the Danish Minister of Defense. He just wanted to be the Danish Minister of Attack at some points, and it just didn't happen for him.
Yeah, you got to be really careful when you sort of stick it around the outside that you don't make contact, because it's always going to be your fault. So that's the case with Kevin Magnussen on Sunday, is that he stuck it around the outside. He tried to hold on for as long as he could, but at the end of the day, it's his fault because he took out Sargent. It was Sargent's corner. He's half a car's lengths in front. Magnussen really. I think we got to be really careful because else Formula One's going down a bit of a difficult path. Because I don't think that I thought in Jeddah, Kevin Magnussen was on the limit. We praised him for it. He was on that limit. I think some of his driving at the weekend crossed over the line, and I think it was dangerous. Look at the amount of penalties he got, and they were all justified. He's crashing into people deliberately, and when that's happening, it's not a good sign for the sport. I just hope that if this continues, then the FIA don't bottle it like they did last season with Pierre Gasly when he was on a lot of penalty points. The season before, I think Pierre Gasly was on like 11 penalty points, but they didn't give him any more penalties, despite there was a couple of instances where he deserved a penalty, because they didn't want him to have a race ban. When, if that happens this time, then he should be given a race ban. So you've got to hope that the FIA are on top of it, but it's not a good look for sport.
Right, let's move on to our average driver ratings for the Miami Grand Prix weekend. And let's begin with our race winner. The first time he's ever won a race, a long time coming, McLaren's own Lando Norris. In sprint qualifying P9, in the sprint he DNF'd on lap 1, and then in qualifying P5 to turn it into a race victory, gaining 4 positions in the process. It's the easiest 10 out of 10 I could have ever given in my life. I think the sheer speed and the sheer amount of confidence and calmness that Lando Norris showed, especially during the Grand Prix, was phenomenal. To say this is his first ever race victory. I mean, he was in the same position in Russia a couple of years ago until obviously he spun off, and that was that. But the calmness, the speed of that McLaren just guided him to a fantastic race victory, and to see a race car that finally beat a Red Bull so comfortably and especially on pace, was tremendous to see. So without saying, Lando Norris, 10 out of 10.
Yeah, I think you summarised it quite well there. What more can you say? It's great to see Lando Norris get that first win. I think it's been a long time coming. So to see him finally do it is very nice. A great day for him. And yeah, that's the thing. It's the fact it's on pace. You can't argue with that result. I think Lando Norris was brilliant all weekend. Obviously, in that sprint race, the contact wasn't his fault, which ruined that. And then, he didn't have the qualifying I think he wanted. I think he said himself he made a couple of errors, which put him that far down. But he had the best pace out there. And there's no denying that. I know Verstappen had a little bit of car damage, but I don't think it makes a difference to that result. I think Norris still wins that because he won by 7 seconds. So he had a comfortable margin. It wasn't as if Verstappen was putting him under a lot of pressure or could put him under a lot of pressure. I think Norris had enough to hold him off. So a great win. And hopefully, like I said, this McLaren can now challenge the Red Bull on a consistent basis. And hopefully this is the first of many.
On to P2 man Max Verstappen. Sprint qualifying P1, sprint P1, easy job done. Qualifying P1, race P2 with a loss of one position. It's not a perfect weekend for Max Verstappen by a long stretch because he's finally realised that the McLarens are able to challenge. I've still given him a 9.5 out of 10. Don't get me wrong, I think he still deserves a very high grade, but it's not a 10 out of 10 that we usually give to him when he storms away and wins the race by about 15 seconds. He was, like we say, he was easily beaten on pace, and he had to settle for a P2 finish. So I've gone with a 9.5 out of 10. Almost a perfect weekend. But Lando Norris was there to spoil the party.
Yeah, I've gone slightly lower. I've gone for a 9 out of 10. I think that, it was his mistake. I think it's when he hit the bollard is when he's picked up the floor damage. So that's his mistake. And he didn't look comfortable throughout that race. You can't, to be fair to him, he did hold his hand up and say, Norris was quicker. So you got to give him a bit of respect for that, but it was a comfortable win for Norris, like we said, and Verstappen, even without, the safety car timing, obviously people will talk about, but I thought that Norris, regardless, had enough. You could argue that, maybe 9 is a little bit nice for Verstappen as well, considering it was his mistake that caused the damage. But I'm sticking with a 9 out of 10. Hopefully, as we said, we can get a few more race winners this season.
On to P3 man, Charles Leclerc, sprint qualifying P2, sprint P2, qualifying P2, and race P3 with a net loss of one place. It's another 9.5 out of 10 because I think Charles Leclerc he's been very consistent. He's still the only driver to finish within the top 5 places in every race this season. And he's continued to do that very well. I mean, the sprint and in his qualifying performances are very, very good. They're up to scratch now. I think we're seeing a lot less Leclerc mistakes. I mean, he had that mistake in practice and he binned it, and that was that on the Friday for him. Well, yeah, Friday morning for him. But he was able to kind of recover from that and score valuable points into the championship, and just kind of continue that consistency that we've been accustomed to see so far this season. So the top 3 are literally separated by 0.5, but I think they all deserve it. They all had very solid weekends, and Charles Leclerc gets a 9.5 out of 10 for me.
Yeah, I've gone for the same grade as I went for Max Verstappen. I've gone for a 9 out of 10. Very quick all weekend. and he was challenging Verstappen for P2. So like I said, very strong pace, and it was unfortunate for him that he couldn't translate it into a victory or to at any point. He only finished a few seconds behind Verstappen in the sprint race as well. He was quite close to him. So I think, apart from Norris, he was the biggest threat to Red Bull. But yeah, it's a very solid performance. I think this was probably, you've got to say, the first weekend where he's been quicker than Sainz all weekend this season. I think China was a bit of both. Sainz was quicker in sprint, but yeah, this was a clean sweep for Charles Leclerc, and that's good to see for him. Because whilst he had top four finishes in every single race, there's an argument that he was beaten by Sainz in a lot of sessions. So it's good for Leclerc to get his feet under the table and to beat Sainz quite comprehensively.
On to our next driver. It's the second Red Bull driver of Sergio Perez. Sprint qualifying P3, finished for sprint in third. Qualified the race in fourth and finished in fourth due to Sainz's penalty. I've gone with an 8, I think, for Sergio Perez. I think another solid weekend for Sergio Perez. But in terms of Max Verstappen, it's nowhere near him. He was well off the pace of Carlos Sainz in the race. And if it wasn't for that 5 second time penalty, he was closer to Lewis Hamilton than he was to Carlos Sainz. So it's I wouldn't say it's another unfortunate weekend for Sergio Perez. It's just one that he's not done particularly well in. Like we say, he was last time out in Miami, he was a race winner, and this time around, he's only able to scoop a podium due to the sprint race. He was nowhere near the pace of the front runners of Norris, Verstappen, or Leclerc, or even Sainz until he got that penalty. So it's a tough weekend for Sergio Perez, but another weekend where he just kind of has to take it in and just go again. I think the team are well behind him still, but you just got to. I think podiums are what are needed from Sergio Perez from now until the end of the season, if he is to secure himself that Red Bull seat for another year. Because with a level Science is at some state at most races, should I say. It could be said that the seat could be swaying in Science's favour, like especially with Science gaining a race victory this season already, and Sergio Perez being unable to do so. So, yeah, I've gone with an 8. It's a good weekend, but not a fantastic one by a long stretch. But it's still a good stepping stone for Sergio Perez.
Yeah, I've got to agree. I've gone for an 8 out of 10 as well. He's only a couple of tenths off in both qualifying sessions. He only finished a few seconds behind Verstappen on track in both races. He finished fifth on track. He was quite lucky that Sainz obviously got that penalty. Oscar Piastri as well got damaged and had to pit because otherwise, he could have been finishing P6 instead of P4. So he's a little bit lucky there. But overall, a solid weekend. I think he's got some good points for the team. And he needs to keep doing what he's doing. But obviously, they need him to be getting podiums. But you can't argue with his performance so far this season. It's only the second race in which he hasn't finished on the podium. Obviously, he's nowhere near Verstappen's pace, but not many drivers would be. But it's a solid result, and you can't argue with his start to the season. He's started the season decently. So 8 out of 10.
On to P5 man, like I say, Carlos Sainz. Sprint qualifying P5, sprint P5, qualifying up in third, and finish the race in fifth. Would have been fourth if it wasn't for that unfortunate, I'll say unfortunate, probably a deserved penalty for the collision with Oscar Piastri. As hard as it is to say for me. Um, but yeah, I'll start with another 8, I think, for Carlos Sainz. Purely on the basis that he also had, similarly to Sergio Perez, he also had quite a relatively good weekend. Like we already mentioned, he was quite off the pace of Charles Leclerc, even though in the race he was saying that he had a lot more pace in him. But he found it hard to pass Oscar Piastri, and unfortunately, Sergio Perez was the beneficiary of his time penalty for the collision. But yeah, another solid weekend for Carlos Sainz and more valuable points for Ferrari.
I've got to say I'm docking a point for Carlos Sainz because of that collision. So I've given him a 7. So it works out quite nicely at 7.5. So my first thoughts looking at it was, yeah, it's a penalty. Sainz has tried to move. He's obviously braked a bit too late. He's run deep into the corner and then, he's collected Piastri because Piastri's had nowhere to go. He's obviously expecting Sainz to turn into the corner and he just hit the brakes too late. Which cost him a couple of points. He's lucky that it wasn't more actually, because I don't think I've seen this season a 5-second penalty being given. Usually it's been 10 seconds, and 10 seconds would have put it in behind Hamilton as well. I think as it was, Sainz was a tenth ahead of Hamilton, so it was like 5.1 the gap. So he's a little bit fortunate in that sense. But overall, it was a solid weekend. But again, it wasn't as quick as Leclerc. And if you're giving Leclerc a 9, I think you got to factor that in. So the highest you can give is an 8. But then I think you should be docked a point for that collision because I thought it was clearly his fault.
I'll agree with you in terms of Carlos Sainz's fault, but when I saw the incident, I think, like you say, he braked a lot later than Oscar Piastri, but I think his car stepped out a little bit. And I think it was that what kind of inflicted the damage on Oscar Piastri, and he kind of collected his front wing in the process. But let's move on to Lewis Hamilton, nevertheless. Sprint qualifying 12th, sprint 16th, qualified 8th, race 6th. If we're going on purely on the basis of Carlos Sainz getting a 7.5, I'll settle with a 7.5 for Lewis Hamilton as well. I think he had a fairly good race. It's just I think Mercedes, especially, it's either their sprint races go very well and the races go shocking, or the races go very well and the sprint goes shocking. They're never both equal, and it's the same with this race weekend in Miami. Had a very good race. Was battling for the top 5 places. Um, but just couldn't get there, unfortunately. But yeah, solid weekend for Lewis Hamilton. 7.5 out of 10.
Yeah, I've got to agree with you on that one. I think the reason his sprint race didn't go too well was because of a certain Danish driver. But, I think that cost him a lot of time because obviously he got ahead and I think he would have overtaken Hulkenberg as well had he not been held up for so long. Got a penalty for, I can't even remember was it speeding in the pit lane? And that's just something that can happen. So I don't think you can deduct him too much, but he did show very good pace on that second stint. He was obviously on the mediums where a lot of drivers were on the hards. But he kept up with Sergio Perez, which was impressive, being in that Red Bull, obviously. He just didn't have the straight line speed to get that overtake done. And obviously finishing a tenth off Carlos Sainz because he dropped off by that point was frustrating. But it's a top 6 finish, and I don't think there's been too many of those to shout about this season, especially for Hamilton, who struggled with this car. But it's a step in the right direction. Hopefully these upgrades will work for Mercedes and they can continue to move onwards and upwards.
From Lewis Hamilton, let's move on to Yuki Tsunoda. Sprint qualifying P15 to secure himself a P8 finish in the sprint, making it up 7 places. Qualified 10th and finished 7th. I've gone with an 8.5 out of 10. What a fantastic performance from Yuki Tsunoda. I mean, gaining a point in the sprint and then a couple of points in the race. Wow. It's night and it's like I think the V Cobs are finally finding their rhythm. And they're finding points quite consistently, especially when you've got a few drivers like your Fernando Alonso's having a bit of a wobble this weekend, like your George Russell's, and obviously Oscar Piastri being out of points as well. So a fantastic performance from Yuki Tsunoda. Long may it continue because I think he's definitely gunning for one of the top seats this in the market right now, and I think he will be gunning for a top seat in 2025. So he's obviously put himself in the shop window, and he's doing no harm by scoring some valuable points for his team. So 8.5 out of 10 from me.
Yeah, I've gone slightly higher. I've gone for a 9 out of 10 for Yuki Tsunoda because I thought it was a brilliant performance. finished seventh in the race. He held off George Russell as well, who is on the same strategy as. And, he continues to deliver, doesn't he? He had a poor sprint qualifying, but then, made up for it by gaining 7 positions to finish eighth. And then obviously qualified 10th and finished seventh in the actual race. So you can't fault too much of what Yuki Tsunoda's done this weekend. It's very close to a 10 out of 10 performance for me, but I've gone for a 9. And yeah, he continues to impress. He continues to do a very, very good job in that RB. And he's moved now up to 10th in the Drivers' Championship as well. So there's a little recognition for his efforts.
I can guarantee you, I can already hear the monkey in my head clapping the cymbals. Um, when we get to Silverstone, all we're gonna hear is, "Oh, Yuki Tsunoda." You know it's gonna happen. You know it is. You just know it is. But what a drive, and he's delivering for VCARB very well. On to P8 man George Russell. So sprint qualifying P11, sprint P12, qualified P7, race P8. I've given him a 7. If I've gone with Lewis Hamilton as a 7.5, I've gone for a 7 for George Russell. May even be a bit lenient. But yeah, I don't know what is happening with George Russell. Sometimes he has a fantastic race, sometimes he just doesn't. He's just very up and down right now this season. And he's just had one of those races in Miami. It just wasn't meant to be. He wasn't on par with Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton comfortably beat him in the race, and to say that George Russell couldn't get past a V carb goes to show that he struggled a lot during the Miami Grand Prix. So I've gone with a 7. May even be lenient. Here comes Ethan's shock rating of about 5 out of 10.
No, I do think you're being quite lenient though with George Russell. I went for a 6 out of 10. But I got to disagree. I think George Russell has been very steady this season. You look at his results: fifth, sixth, seventh, sixth, eighth. He's always been there or thereabouts. He's been on the lower end of the points. But this weekend he was just very anonymous, I thought. Thought Hamilton was quicker than him all weekend. I know he beat Hamilton in qualifying, both qualifyings actually, but in terms of the race pace, if it wasn't for Hamilton's penalty, then he would have beaten him in the sprint, and he was clearly quicker in the race as well. So I think that George Russell had a bit of an anonymous weekend, and I think you're being a little bit lenient there. I've gone for a 6 out of 10.
Another man who had a very, very much anonymous weekend, Fernando Alonso. Would you expect that from Fernando Alonso to have an anonymous weekend? Sprint qualified P8, sprint P17, down 9 places. Qualified P15 and finished in the points in ninth, gaining 6 places. I've also gone with a 7. I've gone on par with George Russell purely on the basis is I think they've both relatively had similar weekends. They've both been anonymous. You're probably going to go for a 6, and it'll even out to a 6.5, so it's okay, so it's fine. But I think I think I've gone trigger happy to be fair with these ratings because most of them, well, only the kind of a lower end of the scale. I've gone a little bit lower, but I think both of those drivers have had anonymous weekends. But it's kind of they've both made the best of a bad situation and finished them with points. So 7 out of 10. Please say you've gone for a 6 so I can even it out to a 6.5.
No, I think you've been very, very lenient there. I don't know how you've given Alonso and Russell 7s and then Hamilton only a 7.5. I've gone for a 5 for Fernando Alonso. I know he's got decent points. He's finished P9. That was really the best he could have hoped for, but he's qualified down in 15th. I know the sprint incident wasn't his fault, but he only qualified 8th. He got beaten by his teammate as well in both qualifying. So I think that's something we need to consider. So yeah, I've gone for a 5 out of 10. Again, it was quite an anonymous weekend. And those two drivers have been very, very solid this year so far, Russell and Alonso. So they had quiet weekends. So yeah, I'll settle out at a 6, but I think that, yeah, 5 out of 10 for me for Fernando Alonso.
On to the man who has dragged Alpine from the depths of hell to a point. Are we settling with a 10 out of 10 for this performance? Because I've gone with a 9. I've not gone as high. I've not gone as high as a 10 out of 10. I've gone with a 9. I mean, if Esteban Ocon was to beat Fernando Alonso, then it probably would have been a 10 out of 10. But I've gone with a 9 out of 10 for Esteban Ocon. So sprint qualifying P13, sprint P15, qualified P13, and finish the race in the points in P10. I've gone with a 9 out of 10, dragging that dumpster of a car from the depths of hell to the points, holding off and fending off Nico Hulkenberg, who himself had a fantastic weekend. But yeah, 9 out of 10. A deserved one. Alpine have finally caught a bit of a break. And they've moved up to 1 point in the championship, moving ahead of teams like Williams and Sauber in the championship. So are they still the basement team? I don't know.
I was tempted to give Esteban Ocon a 10, but I've gone for a 9 as well. But I called it in my predictions. I said Alpine will get a point, and Esteban Ocon delivered. He had a great little tussle as well with Fernando Alonso. I thought that was a really, really good battle between two former teammates. What more can you say? We've actually praised Esteban Ocon a fair bit in this season because he is completely outshone Pierre Gasly, and those are two drivers who you think are at a similar level, similar quality. But he's been brilliant this season, and he's got the point to show for it. He's been unlucky that it's taken him this long with some of his performances. Just missed out last weekend in China, but pulled out the goods in Miami, got themselves a point, and it was well deserved from Esteban Ocon. A great performance, so 9 out of 10.
On to Nico Hülkenberg. Sprint qualifying P10, sprint P7, another points finish. Qualified up in P9 and unfortunately just finished outside of points in P11. I'll go with an 8.5 out of 10. Another fantastic weekend from Nico Hülkenberg. I don't know what he's had for his breakfast. Is it the Valtteri Bottas special of porridge? It could be. But he's just delivering the goods for Haas. He just is. I mean, his teammate is being the defensive masterclass abuser, and then Nico Hulkenberg is the using the attacking prowess. I think if roles reversed, I reckon it could have been the downfall of Haas. But with these roles applied, I think they're doing a fantastic job. And they're utilizing their machinery very well. So it's an 8.5 out of 10 from me for Nico Hulkenberg. Another fantastic weekend for him.
Yeah, I've gone for an 8 out of 10 for Nico Hulkenberg, but yeah, a great weekend. Again, he almost got a point in the race as well, but got a couple of points in the sprint. And he's doing a great job, and you can see why he was a sought after driver in the market as well. I think he's been brilliant again. But not only that, his qualifying performances are still up there, aren't they? He's consistently qualifying in Q3. Another couple of Q3 finishes for him this weekend. And yeah, it's a well-deserved 8 out of 10.
On to Esteban Ocon's teammate Pierre Gasly, qualified for the sprint in 16th, finished the sprint in 9th, qualified for the race in 12th, and finished in 12th. If I've gone with Esteban Ocon as a 9, I've given Pierre Gasly a 7. I think, like we've said, we've kind of seen the Alpine progress, and even though Pierre Gasly is getting beaten by Esteban Ocon quite regularly now, I think he's still trying to hold his own. I think both the drivers are finding this situation hard, and by no means it's going to be no mean feat to drag them from plumb last to regular points finishes. But they're stepping in the right direction, and I think with a P10 and a P12 finish under their belts, it's a positive step in the right direction. Hopefully, we don't jinx them and they continue to finish this well. But it's definitely a positive step in the right direction. So a 7 out of 10 from me.
Yeah, same here, 7 out of 10. It's a good performance from Gasly. He's not had a very good season so far. I'm starting to think he might be off from Alpine at the end of the season, but it's a good performance. Outqualified his teammate in both sessions, but finished behind him in both races. So that's something that he'll obviously be a bit concerned about. Actually, no, he finished 9th in sprint, didn't he? So he was just off getting into the points. So, on another day that would have been him getting Alpine's first points. So unlucky for him, but it's a much better performance. So a well-deserved 7 out of 10.
Let's continue on to the unfortunate man, Oscar Piastri. Well, what could have been? What could have been? P6 in sprint qualifying, P6 in the sprint, P6 qualifying, and ended up in P13. I've gone with an 8 out of 10. I think without that contact, it could have easily been a lot more, a lot more. We could have been looking at an Oscar Piastri P4 finish. And yeah, it's just unfortunate for him because he was having such a good race up until that point. And then the unfortunate contact that sustained front wing damage, he had to pit, had to drop all the way back to the back of the field and then make his way up to P13. Obviously, mining a few penalties here and there for a couple of drivers. Very good to see. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to deliver points on the big occasion in a race. But without it goes without saying that Oscar Piastri is definitely not out of his depth. He's very comfortable in that McLaren team, and he was only a couple of tenths off Lando Norris in qualifying and in sprint qualifying. So he's definitely up there, especially with half the upgrades. So let's see what happens when he gets a full upgrade package. But for the Miami Grand Prix weekend, he gets an 8 out of 10 from me.
Yeah, I've got to go with the same 8 out of 10 for me as well. It was a good performance, I thought, up until that point, which was just unfortunate because he did nothing wrong, really. I thought he defended very well. He was on the limit, and maybe a couple of times he went slightly over defending against Sainz, but he was only 3 seconds behind Verstappen at their pit stops. So it's a great effort from him to get that close. And then just unlucky, almost held off Sainz, but yeah, like I said, that contact was very unfortunate for him. So 8 out of 10 from me.
On to Zhou Guanyu, sprint qualifying in P17, sprint finished in 11th in the sprint, qualified P20 for the race and finished in P14. I've gone with a 6 out of 10. I think we saw quite a lot of good battling from Zhou. He wasn't anonymous as he usually is. I don't know whether F1 like him or not. Like, sometimes you see him, sometimes you don't. But then again, it's all about overtaking, and then the camera cuts to you. But sometimes the camera won't even cut to you when you're making an overtake. But Joe, I think he did relatively well in the race. The sprint was probably his strongest suit, especially with the amount of chaos that ensued in that sprint. But overall, I think it was just another average weekend for Joe Guanyu. Nothing special, nothing out of the extraordinary. It was okay. It was good.
Yeah, similar here, really. I went for a 5 out of 10 though. So his qualifying this season hasn't been his strong suit. You know, that's now his third 20th place. Not got out of Q1 yet, which will be a concern. But you know, his sprint race was good. He made up quite a few positions. Got up to 11th actually with the help of a few penalties. But and then he was the quicker of the two cars in the race as well. So a decent job overall, but again, it's difficult to judge these midfield cars because you don't see any of their action at all.
On to P15 man Daniel Ricciardo. Sprint qualifying fourth, sprint fourth, qualified eighth, and finished the race in 15th. Compared to his teammate, it's a long way away in the race. But when you look at his sprint performance, it was fantastic. I have to with a 7 out of 10 for Daniel Ricciardo. I think the sprint kind of carried him throughout this weekend. I think his qualifying performance ahead of a race was just bland and poor. And then the race, he made up 3 places, but yeah, it wasn't amazing in the race. You were expecting a bit more from him, especially when he's just finished the sprint in fourth. But yeah, it was a good weekend for Daniel Ricciardo on the Friday, and the first part of the Saturday. But the second part of the Saturday and the Sunday just didn't go his way. But I've still settled with a 7 out of 10.
Yeah, I went for an 8 out of 10 just because of that, how good that sprint was. You know, he's qualified up in fourth, and then he's held off so many cars. He's held off, you know, a Ferrari and a McLaren in sprint. So it's such an exceptional performance. But this is where it comes down to how difficult it is to judge on a sprint weekend, because obviously the race was terrible. But you know, he still got 5 points, which is eighth place in an actual race, and if you're judging it off that, you're giving him a very high grade. So he's got off the mark this season. He's added a decent amount of points there. And before the actual race, he was only 3 points behind Sonoda. So from one sprint race, he's got a large chunk of what Sonoda had up to that point. So an 8 out of 10 from me, but I'll settle with a 7.5 as it averages out to.
On to Valtteri Bottas, who qualified for the sprint in 18th and finished for sprint in 14th. Qualified for the race in 16th and finished 16th. It's a 5 out of 10 if you've ever seen one. It's just average. I mean, at one point, if you were watching the race up to date, Ethan, at one point he was up in second in the driver of a Evo, which yes, I was quite shocked as well when I saw Valtteri Bottas's face pop up below Lando Norris in the driver of a Evo. Bearing in mind, Valtteri Bottas was running up until that point in 18th. I was very shocked by that. But it's just a average weekend. I think from the highs of China to kind of the lows of Miami. And it was just a bog standard weekend for Kick Sauber. And it was just average. That's all I can say. Just average. I'm repeating just average, but it literally was average.
Yeah, I've got to agree. I've gone for a 5 out of 10 as well. It's very, very poor performance, and there isn't a whole lot more to say. Um, so it's got to be a 5 out of 10 from Valtteri Bottas.
On to our favourite man, Mr. Lance Castrol. Sprint qualified in P7, sprint DNF, qualified in for the race in P11 and race finished in P17. I've gone with a 4 out of 10. Shoot me if you want to. But he's another driver that got a penalty and was dropped down the order because of it. Um, the only good factor that saves him throughout this weekend was his qualifying performances. That's about all you're getting from Lance Stroll. His qualifying performances were good. The races were awful. 4 out of 10.
Yeah, that's higher than I gave him. I gave him a 3 out of 10 because, again, he has finished DNF in the sprint, and he was the cause of that contact between him and Alonso, not because of Hamilton. I think that got overlooked a little bit because of, obviously Hamilton diving down the inside, caught all the headlines, but what you're actually ignoring is the fact that Lance Stroll actually drove into Fernando Alonso anyway. Um, and then he finished 17th in the race. 17th. He only beat Alex Albon and Kevin Magnussen. So that says it all. And his teammate has finished ninth. So he started 4 places above his teammate and finished 8 places below him. So what more do you have to say? And I'm being very nice and giving him a 3 out of 10. I gave him a point for each of the times he outqualified Alonso.
You know what? That's funny. I'll give it to you. On to our next driver, Kevin Magnussen. Sprint qualified P14, finished for sprint in P18, qualified in 19th and finished in 18th. I've gone with another 4 out of 10. I'm being nice. But I mean, the kind of the maneuvers he was doing throughout this weekend can be labelled as very questionable. And all I'm gonna say is Kevin Magnussen, 4 out of 10. And in my notes, it says stick to defending and not attacking. That's all.
Even the defender's questionable at times, isn't it, though? Yeah, like I
Yeah,
said,
I do agree with you with the defending being a little bit questionable. But it's all for the greater good. Let's put it that way.
yeah, like I said, it's bordering on a bit dangerous now. I think he was right on the absolute limit at Jeddah, and then he's turned it up a couple of notches. He's just blatantly cutting chicanes and then not giving the position back. For the team game, obviously, but when you're overtaking a driver off the track, when you're crashed into drivers deliberately as well, it's not a good look for sport, as I said earlier on. And I really hope if this continues into the next race or whenever, Monaco especially, that the FIA have the bottle to say, no, you've got your points penalty, you've got your penalty points limit. you're not racing for the next one. And I really hope they actually stick to it and don't bottle it like they did for Gasly a couple of seasons ago.
On to Alexander Albon, sprint qualified in P20th, finished for sprint in 13th, qualified for the race in 14th, and finished in 19th. I'm gonna settle with another four, I think. It's not the weekend that Alex Albon would have envisaged. And it's definitely not the weekend that Williams will have envisaged. They've gone quite a few races now without a point, and I think it is starting to get to the point of concerning. Because Alex Albon, I don't know how many points he had at this stage of the season, but I'm pretty sure he had more than zero. So yeah, it's a 4 out of 10. I don't know whether it's unlucky or whatnot because don't know why, but it feels like it seems to me that at some stages Williams aren't progressing forward, they're going backwards. And I don't want to see them go backwards because they've built a lot of what they are doing at the moment from last season. And I don't know whether it's just unraveling a little bit. I don't know whether the fairy tale season, which this season should have been, is kind of being brushed aside and kind of swept away. I've gone with a 4 out of 10. It's a poor weekend. But I'm sure Alex Albon, Williams' team, Logan Sargent will pick themselves up and try to go again at Imola and try and score some points at last.
Yeah, I've given a 5 out of 10 to both Williams drivers. Thought Alex Albon had a very average weekend. He made a lot of places in the sprint, um, starting from last after having his lap time deleted, obviously, but had no pace in the actual race. And the Logan Sargent as well made up a lot of places in the sprint, finished 10th in the sprint, and then was taken out of the race unfairly. Having a good battle with Magnussen, but then obviously Magnussen went over the limit and completely wiped him out. So 5 out of 10 for both of them. I can't really separate the two.
Yeah, I've gone a little bit higher for Logan Sargent purely on the basis of that sprint where he finished in 10th and obviously made those places up from P19 to finish in 10th. Like you say, he qualified in 17th of the race and DNF'd. I've given him a 5 out of 10. I've separated him with Alex Albon a little bit. They both made up a lot of places, but Logan Sargent made up just a few more places up in the sprint. And then obviously in the race, he wasn't able to finish it because he was taken out by Kevin Magnussen, who fancied a little bit of an attack, a little bit of an attack, which culminated in both of them going for a little bit of a spin and Logan Sargent coming worse out of that situation. But that rounds off episode 15 of On the Grid podcast, Miami Grand Prix review. Thank you, Ethan, for joining me on this episode. We'll be back next weekend looking over our predictions from this weekend and looking ahead to the Imola Grand Prix, which hopefully goes ahead after it was cancelled last year. Fingers crossed. In the meantime, thank you for engaging. Thank you for listening. Like I say, we'll see you next week. Goodbye.